Hello everybody, thank you for inviting me to speak to you today to give you an introduction to the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland's archives and to virtually walk you through some of our world-class brass collections. My name is Stuart Harris-Logan and I'm the Keeper of Archives and Collections here at RCS. The physical archive itself is actually kept separate to the conservatoire in an old disused whisky bond, and our instrument collections, which I'll come on to talk about later, are actually in an old disused tobacco bond. So you might like to think of us as an archive of bad habits. Obviously, in this short time, I can't really give more than just a glancing overview of our collections, and we'll be missing a lot out in the process. But hopefully this taster will be enough to whet your appetite, and I'm always very keen to speak privately or correspond via email if anyone has any specific research they'd be interested in. Well, as you'll imagine, we store the entire history of the institution, which goes back some 174 years, if you can believe. That's things like old prospectuses telling us we taught things like elocution and deportment, as well as boring things like logic and business studies once upon a time. Things like old staff records, which tell us we appointed the first woman professor in the UK back in the 1890s. Old minute books that tell us that Charles Dickens actually presided over our opening soiree back in December 1847. Here you can see his signature on our Book of Strangers, which is a visitor's book to you and I. But we don't just curate our own history, as interesting and as important as it undoubtedly is. We also have a large number of collections and archives which have come to us from other sources, which make our holdings so diverse and interesting, and such a special place to play in and learn from. You'll notice I'm drawing a distinction between archives and collections, and the difference is a little technical but important. The short version is that archives are archives speak and collections are museums speak, and we're really a bit of both, but I'll come to that. Archives first. For anyone old enough to remember Jimmy Logan, we have his archive at RCS, and it's one of the largest individual archives I have ever seen. Basically, the contents of his personal study were boxed up and shipped to us wholesale. So we have his joke books and his scripts, his personal photographs and letters, even some of his old pantomime Dane costumes and props. We've got the Britannia Panopticon Archive, the UK's oldest surviving music hall, where Stan Laurel first cut his teeth before he started to work alongside Oliver Hardy. We've got the John Steen Archive. John was an opera critic who literally wrote the book on opera singers in the 20th century. Actually, in point of fact, he wrote 3. We've got an early and important music archive, which includes original handwritten compositions by composers like Frank Spedding and Eric Chisholm, as well as very early printed music, including a set of Mozart works, which in all probability were published in Mozart's own lifetime. But more than that, what we're really strong on and what we're really known for is our specialist subject, brass. Now, I should caveat this before going on that I'm not a brass player or even a musician, but in my job, I meet an awful lot of them. So where to start? They range a lot in terms of scope and level, but one of the most scholarly is the archive of Ed Tarr, who sadly died last spring. Ed wasn't just an incredible trumpet player and enthusiast on Baroque trumpet. He was also a very highly respected musicologist and academic. He was the founding curator and director of the Trumpet Museum in Bad Säckingen in Germany, and he edited an incredible number of performance editions of trumpet music, including the complete works of Torelli. We acquired the Tarr archive in 2014, so we have all of his original research, the research he made into these Tarr editions, as well as biographical research on historical trumpeters, an impressive collection of trumpet method books, which includes the more unusual ones like the Russian methods, unpublished dissertations and theses on the trumpet, many of which he examined as a world authority on the subject, and many of Ed Tarr's own performance recordings. When we talk about biographical research on trumpet players, though, we really need to talk about another author and trumpet enthusiast, Friedel Keim. Where Ed Tarr wrote the first truly scholarly history of the trumpet, Friedel Keim wrote the largest who's who of trumpet players past and present, which now runs into 3 volumes. We actually acquired the Keim archive before the Tarr archive, and if anything, it's even larger. Where he could, Keim would write to trumpet players to provide biographical information for his books, but for those of them who had already passed to the great brass band in the sky, we also have all of his primary research into them, and that is a goldmine. I'm just going to pick on one, a personal favourite, Louis Armstrong. Somehow, Friedel Keim managed to drag up quite a bit of research on Armstrong's association with Ernst Model, the inventor of the emo mute. Here we see just a small sample of that research. In addition, we also have the Robert Minter archive, an amassing of around 750 rare and early trumpet repertoire. Minter had his own plane, and he seems to have travelled the world, charming his way into private archives and collections, and taking copies of all the rarely seen trumpet music he could get his hands on. Sometimes these were actually facsimile copies of the original manuscripts themselves, but more often the owners had more sense and wouldn't allow him to do that. So what we have are Minter's own handwritten transcriptions on music manuscript paper. They're incredibly neat. You could happily perform directly from them without needing to digitally typeset them. We have a number of other archives, which I don't really have time to tell you about, other than to just mention them. We've got Ernest Hall's handwritten and unpublished trumpet method. Ernest Hall taught anyone who was somebody in the world of trumpet in the latter half of the 20th century. We've got the Crystal Palace Brass Band Championships archive, which date to the early days of Queen Victoria's reign, which contains an incredible social history of who was playing what in the mid-19th century. These are the days when virtually every coal mine in Britain had its own brass band, as well as local communities and townships. We have the original handwritten compositions of Sir Ernest Bullock, one of our previous principals. Apparently the students called him Deadly Ernest. And that's important because he composed the fanfares and arranged the national anthem for the performance at the present Queen's coronation, and also for the coronation of her father, King George VI. But there's an elephant in the room at this point, and that's the big name I've left to last, John Webb. John Webb was a person who really defied description, but for our purposes, I'm going to focus in on 2 of his many passions: collecting instruments you blow into and making them. That was one of the many things that made John unique. He didn't just have one of the largest private collections of brass and wind instruments in the world, but he also made them too in his improbably lean-to of a workshop at the back of his house in Wiltshire. We acquired the John Webb collection in 2014, and this is where adjectives like world-class and historic come into play. It's thanks to John that we have weird and wonderful instruments like this, a serpent, described to me once as the grandfather of the tuba. This one is keyed, as you can see, and beautifully restored. The problem with this instrument isn't that it's functionally extinct. Orchestras don't use them anymore, but that it actually has 14 keys. We don't know of anyone anywhere else in the world with quite so many as that, and for good reason, I should imagine. Most of us only have 10 fingers. There are hundreds of instruments in the John Webb collection, ranging from the truly historic, such as a rare trombone made by Adolphe Sax, the inventor of the saxophone. He didn't make many of those, to the usable, everyday variety. And this is where we are quite unusual among museums and archives. We encourage our students and staff to borrow them and to play on these instruments themselves. Right now, we've actually got 17 instruments signed out and in active use. All but the very rarest are for this purpose. Musical instruments are no use on display, decorative though many of them are. They're meant to be played. We didn't just get the instruments themselves, however. We also have a number of John's own manufacturing designs, as you can see here, separated by instrument. And we also took a range of bits and bobs from his workshop. This is actually how he stored many of his materials, in old jam jars and the like, and I think there's something quite charming about keeping them that way in our archive. So that's about as brief as I can make it, but I hope you've got at least a bit of an overview of the richness and diversity of the RCS's archives and collections, and the joy and the privilege that is mine as their keeper. Thank you all very much.